Okay. So Boker Tov. So let's pick up. We are at the top of Daf Kaf Bet Amud Bet, Masechet Beitzah. And we're still going through, right? The Mishnah said there were three things by which Rabban Gamliel said that we are machmer like Beit Shammai. Okay, I think we got up to the two dots at the top of Daf Kaf Bet. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we got up to the two dots, right? Okay, so then the third case in the Mishnah was we said Einofin pitin glitzin ela lekikim. Okay, now the Gemara is going to try and understand exactly what we're talking about. The Mishnah said that Beit Shammai said you can't cook thick bread on Yom Tov, but only thin bread. If we just go back to the Mishnah for a moment, so we'll see it. Right, the Mishnah of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet said, right, Shlosha Dvarim Rabban Gamliel Machmir Kedavei Beit Shammai. So we said, "Ein Tumim Tachamin, Nakatchil B'Yom Tov, Ein Tzukvin Tam Noah B'Yom Tov, Ve'ein Ofin Pitin Glitzin Ela Rekikin." So Amar Rabban Gamliel Mehen Shabet Abba Lo Hayu Ofin Pitin Glitzin Ela Rekikin. Rabban Gamliel says this is the way that we always used to do it. In my father's house, that was the tradition. They would only make thin bread on Yom Tov, not thick bread. אמרו לה מה נעשה לבית אביך שהיו מחמיאים על עצמם ומקילין לכל ישראל להיות רופאים פיתין קצין וחללין. In other words, they said to him, no, that was a chumrah that they had, but that's not a chumrah that's required for everybody. But nonetheless, that is what Rabban Gamliel paskins. So you see Rashi on the Mishnah says, Pitin Gritzin, he says, why? What's the problem? Why do Beit Shammai say you can't make these thicker loaves? He says, Kikarot avin mishum tilcha. Because of tircha. It's going to be too much work to do on Yom Tov. You can make the thin breads and that's enough. Okay. So now the Gemara says, we're back in the Gemara of Kaf Bet Amud Bet. Raya brings up right. Rav said, Ein ofin pitin gritzin ela rikiki. And we say, Tanu Rabbanan. Beit Shammai omrim, Ein ofin pat aveh bepesach. Ubeit Hillel matirin. So at least at the first stage, it seems to be that this Braita is talking about the same subject as our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah said that Beit Shammai said you can't bake these thick loaves. You have to deal with the thin loaves on Yom Tov. And seemingly that's what the Braita says, the same thing. However, there's a slight difference. Right? You'll notice that here the language is not between gritzin and kikim, but here it's pat aveh. That actually means thick bread, right? A thick loaf. Okay, that's difference number one. Number two, what does the Braita talk about? It says here, the Pesach. It doesn't say on Yom Tov, it says on Pesach. So maybe we're talking about something else. So we have a machloket here that Beit Shammai say you cannot bake thick bread. And if we're talking about Pesach, so obviously we mean matzah, right? Matzah is also called bread, right? It's called pat. Also, it's the bracha. When we eat matzah on Pesach, we say motzi lechem min haaretz. It's you can't eat bread on Pesach. So okay, lechem in that sense refers to matzah, not chametz. Okay, matzah and chametz are both called bread. But so he says you can't make the thick bread on Pesach. Ubeit Hillel matirin, but Beit Hillel allow it. So why over here? So what's the problem? Says Rashi, near the top of the Amud, Rashi says, B'Pesach, Kasal Kadatach. So whenever Rashi tells us Kasal Kadatach, means I think at this point, meaning he's already giving me a clue that the Gemara is going to change the conclusion, but at this point we understand. You would think, Sheino Yachol L'Shamra Me'achmitz, right? What's going to be the problem with thick bread? You're going to think that Beit Shammai is saying, Beit Hillel says it's fine, but Beit Shammai says no, because maybe it's going to become chametz. Right? We have a whole discussion, the Gemara Pesachim, we have a whole Siman Shulchan Aruch talking about when you bake the matzah, what happens if the matzah is a little bit thicker and there's parts that maybe weren't fully cooked, or the matzahs were stuck together, and there's parts of the dough that weren't fully cooked, and maybe we're concerned that those are going to become chametz. So here, Beit Shammai tells me you can't make pat aveh on Pesach, because seemingly at this point we're worried that it's going to become chametz. Beit Hillel matirin. Beit Hillel says it's allowed. We're not concerned. Okay, now kama pat aveh. Says the Gemara. Okay, it's very nice. When you say thick bread, what do you mean thick bread? What is considered thick? Right? How thick is thick? So kama pat aveh. Amal avona tefach. This is up to a tefach. Okay, so it's pretty thick. Pretty thick. Why? Where do we find a tefach from? Sheken matzinu belechem apanim tefach. Okay, the lechem apanim in the Beit HaMikdash was tefach thick. And the lechem hapanim, despite its name, is actually matzah. Okay, have a look at Rashi. Rashi says, shkem matinu belechem hapanim, shu matzah. Kidamrinan bekol hamnachot, ba'ot matzah. All the menachot, this the Gemara over there tells me that the mincha offering has to be matzah. The lechem hapanim is matzah as well. Ve'oviot tefach. כשמו לחם הפנים, יש לו פנים, ואין פנים פחותים מטפח. Okay, so we understand, we learn over there that the word panim means it can't be less than a tefach. Okay, but the fact is, you can get up to a tefach, and that could be, that's the thickness of the bread, and we're not concerned that it's going to become chametz. So therefore, when Beit Shammai says you can't do paraveh, it means paraveh is more than a tefach. So now the Gemara says, hang on a second, right? So Amar Rav Huna tefach. Rav Huna said it's a tefach sheken matzinu belechem hapanim, because that's what we have by the lechem hapanim. The Gemara is not going to say how can you compare. He says sheken matzinu belechem hapanim tefach. Matkifla. Rav Yosef says to Rav Huna the following. He says, Im amru bizrizin, yomru b'sheinan's rizin. Essentially, we're saying you can ask a number of questions, but what Rav Yosef is saying is that you can't compare what's going on in the Beit HaMikdash. We found this many times, where we find a certain halacha by the Beit HaMikdash, we find a certain halacha by the Kohanim, which we assume, okay, they're going to be scrupulous and they're going to keep things the way they're meant to. But just because things were done in the Beit HaMikdash in a certain way, and we're not choshesh for a takala, it does not mean necessarily that everywhere else, right? In the Beit HaMikdash, we said you could bake up to a tefach, and it's not going to become chametz. So first of all, we say, right, imam rubas rizin. Rizim means those people that are very, very scrupulous in their observance, and they know what they're doing. But Rizin says here, Rashi, Shal Beit Garmu. So this was the family who would make the lechem hapanim. Shayu umanim v'zrizim b'davar. They were skilled and they were very careful the way they did it. So therefore, they were able to do it. We can't compare to other people. That's number one. Number two, he says, Imam ruba pat amela, yom ruba pat sheina amela. Amela avia means you're really working the bread, you're working the dough as you're preparing the bread. Okay, Rashi says, Shayat ta'un gimel me'ot shifa shifshuf biyado. You have to be sort of manipulating it with your hands all the time. V'chameshmot beita be'egrof, and you're punching it. Afachat shafachat boet shtayim, shtaf shtayim boet shalosh b'menachot. Okay, there the Gemara Menachot explains the whole procedure of how you would cook the lechem hapanim. But again, these are principles the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim tells us when it comes to chimutz. So all the time that you are mitasek, all the time that you are manipulating, you're moving, you're doing stuff with the dough, it's not going to become chametz. When's it going to become chametz? When you leave it by itself. So the lechem hapanim, you're doing stuff with it all the time. You're going to compare that to dough that you're just leaving, ordinary dough that you're just leaving and cooking. So no. Okay, number three. He says, Imamru beitzim yeveshim, yomru beitzim lachim. Okay, so we spoke about who's cooking, and we spoke about what they're cooking, and now we're talking about how they're cooking. So the wood that you would use in the Beit HaMikdash for the lechem hapanim, there we're talking about special dry wood. Okay, and you might be using now, when you're just baking at home, you might be using wood that's going to be a bit wet, so it's not going to be as hot. Rashi says, Eitzim yeveshim, mitu be'av, Hayu poskim menichot eitzim lamalacha Masechet Ta'anit. Okay, from Tu B'Av they would stop chopping down trees, and me'etzei lishkat eitzim hayu ofinu vashlim kol tzokei mikdash. In other words, throughout the summer, when the wood is very, very dry, that's when they would collect it. They would put it inside the lishkat eitzim, which is a special chamber, a special place in the Beit HaMikdash, where they would keep all the wood, and they would ensure they have all the dry wood from the summer, and that's what they would use. After Tu B'Av, they'd go to the storehouse and take that wood, not take the wood out, not chop any more wood from the field. In other words, this is going to be extra hot. Okay. So im yomru beitzim yeveshim, yomru beitzim lachim. Im amru b'tanu cham, yomru b'tanu tzonen. Okay. The oven in the Beit HaMikdash that they're using to cook the lechem hapanim is going to be very, very hot because it's on all the time. Says Rashi, "Mesikin oto b'chol yom, hen limnachot, hen letzli." Every day they would be putting on the fire. And that's an oven of metal, which is also going to be hot as opposed to an oven of cheres, which may not get to as hot as well. There you see Rashi says matechet b'mesechet zvachim. Okay, we're going through Kodshim this morning, right? B'Mesechet Zvachim Amrina and Tanusha Mikdash Shamatechet Haya. There it says the oven for the Mikdash was made of matechet, made of metal. Mishom shte alechem v'alechem hapanim shafiyatan u'kedushatан batanur hava leklei shalit v'klei shalit acheles lo avdinan. Essentially, the shte alechem and the lechem hapanim is considered like a kli sharet, which has to be made with metal and not through cheres. Okay, so because of all those differences, therefore you can't compare. Therefore, even if the lechem hapanim was up to a tefach, maybe that's still going to be too thick for us when we're cooking on Pesach, at least according to Beit Shammai. So now, so says the Gemara, we're on the first wide line in the Gemara. It says, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Shailit Rebbe Beichud. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, I went and I asked Rebbe, says Beichud, says Rashi, Beini Leveino, this was a private consultation, right? Private question, not in the Beit Midrash in front of everybody. Maybe that's why the others didn't know. But it says, Shailit Rebbe Beichud, Umanu Rav. It says, what does it mean when I say Rebbe? Who am I talking about? Talking about Rav. I said, my pataveh. So what is pat aveh, right? If it's not a tefach, what is it? So he says pat merubeh. So we change our whole understanding. We thought until now that when you said pat aveh, you meant you're talking about the thickness of the loaf. No. That's not what we're talking about, and therefore it was the same as what we saw in the Mishnah talking about patin gritzin and patin rukikin. He says no, we're talking about something else completely. When we say pat aveh in this braita, we mean pat merubeh. I mean, you're cooking a lot of bread. I'm not talking about how thick each loaf is, but I'm saying you're going to go and you're going to cook many. So, Ika da Amri Amarav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amarav Sheilited Rebbe B'Yichud Aman Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Okay, so here's just a different version of this. Who was the one when he says he was asking Rebbe? First we said it means he was asking Rav. Here we say it's asking Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Who is Rebbe? Who is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi? Okay, so he asks him, says, my pat aveh. He says, pat merubeh. Again, what does it mean? What does it mean, pat merubeh? It means pat aveh. It means pat merubeh. So have a look at Rashi over here. Rashi says pat merubeh. He says v'lav mishum chimutzu. Okay, this has got nothing to do with the fact that it's going to be too thick and it's going to become chametz. No. Ela mishum detalach tilcha yetela lemachar or leyom acher. Rather, what's the problem with pat merubeh? That this is a tircha yetera, that you're performing unnecessary work. We know, we've learned many times, you're allowed to perform melacha, melechet ochel nefesh, that you need for Yom Tov and Yom Tov. But you can't perform melechet ochel nefesh, even bishul, when it's not for Yom Tov. So you're baking a lot of bread and lots of loaves. You know that part of it is not for Yom Tov. You're cooking for today and for tomorrow and for next week, right? During the week, I'm going to be busy. I'm going to be whatever. Now I have Yom Tov. I'm going to bake all the bread I need and put it in my freezer. I'm going to bake all the matzah I need and put it in my cupboard. Okay, no, you can't do that. So that's what he says when it says pat aveh. It means pat merubeh. If that's the case, so I understand why Beit Shammai say you can't do it. Why do Beit Hillel say you can do it? Okay, so Rashi points out, yes, it's Beit Hillel matirin kidamrinan shapat nefa yafeh kshatanu maleh. Okay, this probably wouldn't apply to our ovens nowadays, but in the way the oven worked over there is that when you fill up the oven, then everything is going to cook better. So the fact that you're baking extra loaves, it's not the fact that you're baking for after Yom Tov. I'm baking those extra loaves because that is going to allow the loaf for Yom Tov itself to bake better, and therefore it's Sorech Yom Tov, and therefore Beit Hillel says it's okay. So that's what we say, right? My pat aveh pat merubeh, says the Gemara. So v'amai kari lei pat aveh. So it says the Gemara, we have a problem, but that's not what it says. It doesn't say pat merubeh. It says pat aveh. It says the Gemara, why does it call it that? Why is it so misleading? Mishum de nefisha belisha. So two answers. Answer number one, right? Amai karulei pat aveh mishum de nefisha belisha, meaning that there's a lot of it, and there's a lot when we say pat aveh, the dough is going to be very, very thick because you're making a large dough. Then you're going to separate it into the different loaves that you're cooking, but nonetheless, it's still called that. Inami. Right, inami. Okay, people have different ways of speaking, different terminology in the place of that Tana, right? That's what they called it. That when they said pat aveh, everybody knew that what you meant was pat merubeh. That was kind of the way they spoke about it. So michdi mishum de katarach tircha de lot tzarich. So now we say like this. We originally learned the Braita. Okay, when we saw the Braita, we thought that the reason why Beit Shammai said no was because you worried that it's going to become chametz. Now we're saying it's got nothing to do with chametz because we're not talking about pat aveh, but in fact we're talking about pat merubeh. And what's the problem with pat merubeh? You're cooking too much of it, that it's going to be an unnecessary tircha. So that's what the Gemara says. Now michte. So now that we've established mishum dakatarach tircha delot tzarechu, that the reason why you can't do this is because it's tarech, right? Tircha delot tzarech. You are doing an unnecessary tircha. So well, then if that's the case, my area Pesach, afilu b'shayimim tovim nami. So why did the Braita say you can't do this on Pesach? If this has got to do with doing melacha and Yom Tov, but nothing to do with chimutz, why did the Tana of our Braita say that it's on Pesach that you can't do it? Why didn't he say that it's on Yom Tov you can't do it? Afilu b'shayimim tovim nami. So says the Gemara, Einachinami. Says the Gemara, you're right. Einachinami. V'tana b'yom tov the Pesach katanya. Right? It happened to be that this case was on Pesach, and therefore the Tana of V'yah said Pesach, but Einachinami would apply. It would apply to any Yom Tov as well. Tanya Namiachi, we learn similarly in Braita, Beit Shammai Amrim Enofin Pat Merubeh b'Yom Tov. Ubeit Hillel Matirin. Okay, there we have a Braita which says explicitly there it says Beit Shammai says you don't cook pat merubeh on Yom Tov, and Beit Hillel say it's allowed. Okay, so what comes out of it is we have two different dinim. We have very similar, but they are slightly different. There's the case of the Mishnah and the case of the Braita. Now Mishnah said Einofin pat gritzim. Both of them we have a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. In the Mishnah, we said enofin pat gritzin ela rakikin, that the loaf itself you can't bake very thick bread. Rather, you have to bake the thin bread. That is according to Beit Shammai. According to Beit Hillel, you could bake the thicker bread as well. Seemingly because there's a certain tircha when I'm cooking of making the bread a little bit thicker. Then we have a different thing, which is machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about pat merubeh, meaning if I'm going to make a lot of bread, I'm going to make many loaves. Beit Hillel say you can't. Beit Shammai say you can't, because that again is unnecessary tircha that you're doing for the sake of after Yom Tov, you're doing it for the sake of chol. Beit Hillel say no. Beit Hillel say it's allowed because it's by filling up the tanur, you're causing the bread to cook better, and that's why it would be permitted. Okay, and that brings us to our next Mishnah. Again, we are on Kaf Bet Amud Bet. We're halfway down the Amud, right? This next Mishnah. So if our previous Mishnah said Rabban Gamliel was saying three things which he would be machmir. Okay, in that case, he was machmir like Beit Shammai as opposed to Beit Hillel. Here, there's no mention of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, but here our Mishnah, which is a continuation, says Afu Amar Shlosha Dvarim Lakel. Rabban Gamliel said three things that he was machmir about, and he also says three things that he is makel about. Right? And again, we can learn from this that it's very important. There is a case in the Gemara of there was a certain Beit Din where they asked him a certain question and they allowed it. They said it's mutar. And they asked him another question. And they said it's mutar. And they asked him another question and they said, everybody's going to know that we're the Beit Din that says everything's mutar. So we can't answer that question. We have to see. Meaning sometimes you ask a Rav, you ask a person, say, are you a machmir or a maker? And they answer, I'm not a machmir, I'm not a maker. But it depends what the thing is. Sometimes you have to be machmir, and sometimes you have to be maker. But if it's right, if all the time the answer is always asur, 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 the answer is always mutar, mutar, so then we have to. So then at least people are going to start wondering, okay, is this correct? So the Mishnah shows us Rabban Gamliel says, don't worry, he was machmir about certain things, he was maker about certain things. Okay, he wasn't machmir about everything, just for the sake of being machmir. But that's how we thought that the halacha should be. So in our previous Mishnah, we saw three things Rabban Gamliel said he was machmir about. Now we say afu haya or afu amar shlosha dvarim lakel. So Rabban Gamliel also said three things to be maker on Yom Tov. Okay, so number one, mechabdin, and obviously, if the Mishnah needs to tell us, it needs to single out Rabban Gamliel, means not everybody agrees. Okay, number one, he says mechabdin beit mitot. You can mechabdin, in this case means to sweep. To sweep the beit mitot. Beit mitot literally means the house of beds. What does that mean? Again, we've said many times, bayit and cheder are essentially interchangeable in the language of Chazal. Here it's talking about the chadar ochel. It's talking about the room where you eat. Why is the room where you eat called the Beit HaMitot? So we all remember from Pesach, right? That you lean to the left when you recline when you're eating. That's the way that they would eat in those days. They would have beds where they would eat. Right? They wouldn't sit on chairs. They would sit on these beds, and that's how they would eat. Says Rashi of Yam Machabdim Beit HaMitot, Beit HaMesiba. Sheochlin sham. In other words, this is the place where you are eating. Shayu mesubin ve'ochlin al gabei mitot. They would lean, you would recline, and you would eat like that. Why are we going to have a discussion as to whether you can sweep the room or not? So again, nowadays, the truth is, it's a fascinating discussion when it comes to halacha lemaaseh, about whether you can sweep your house on Yom Tov and on Shabbos. But the problem with sweeping, again, on a tiled floor, in and of itself, there'd be no issue. But in those days, the floor, many times, the floor of a home was dirt. The floor was the floor. And we are concerned about la'ashvuye gumot, that you're going to be creating holes, you're going to be smoothing out the ground, which might be related to the malacha of plowing. And that's the discussion about sweeping on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So Rabban Gamliel was machmir. He said it was maker over here. He says mechabdin beit hamitot. You can sweep the room where you're eating. Okay. Umanichin et mugmar b'Yom Tov. He says you can place the mugmar on Yom Tov. Mugmar, Rashi says, levona al gabei kechalim. It's type of spice that you would place on top of coals. Okay, it's the spice that they would burn for incense called mugmar. The Gemara in Masechet Tubot goes into a bit more detail about it. We discussed, was it last week or a couple of weeks ago? We remember we saw the Machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about heating up water on Yom Tov, right? And we spoke about heating up water to shower with your body, and we said, according to Tosfot, that was a problem because it is not shaveh lechol nefesh. The things that we can do, which are for ochel nefesh, but nonetheless still needs to be shaveh lechol nefesh, meaning it's a normative need and it's not a luxurious need. The source for the din of shaveh lechol nefesh comes from the din of mugmar. The Gemara in Ketubot talks about doing this, right, smelling these, burning and smelling these spices on Yom Tov, and it says that is something which only mefunakim do. That's something which only very pampered people do. That is not shaveh lekol nefesh. So here, Rabban Gamliel says, again, and the Gemara will say exactly what it means, but it says manichin et mugmar b'Yom Tov. You can place the spices, okay, that he would allow. And finally, it says vosin gdim kulas b'leilei psachim v'chachamim osrim. Okay, Chachamim Mosrin over here refers to all three. But so this Gedim Ukulas, this the type of lamb which you would, or goat, which you would cook to eat on the night of Pesach, Rabban Gamliel allows it. Now we're dealing here after the Churban. So Rashi says, Mukulas kra'avu b'nei me'av tluyin chotzelo b'tzido chotzoleo. Essentially, it's like you can imagine it's on a spit, and that's how you cook it. Vayuosin zechel mikdash. Okay, this is the way that they would do when they had the Korban Pesach. So they do it as zechel mikdash. Rabban Gamliel says you can do that. Chachamim osrin. So we say that the sages forbid not just this case of dimukulash, but all three cases. Rashi, the next Dibra Matcha, we says Chachamim osrin. Is it b'shloshtan? With all three. Bekibud mishum gumot, right? Regarding sweeping, because you're going to straighten out holes and things on the floor. Uvamugma mishum delav tzorach kol nefesh. When it comes to mugma, Chachamim say no, this is not shavel kol nefesh. Umaytam asirin alei bektubot perek rishon. Asher yachol lechol nefesh. Davar hashaveh lekol nefesh. Right? The pasuk says asher yachol lechol nefesh. We learn from the words lechol nefesh that it means davar hashaveh lechol nefesh. V'zeh eino ela lemufunakim. This is only for mufunakim. This is a luxurious thing. This is not something that a normative need that everybody would do. You know, it's like showering every day. It's not something that everybody can. Okay, we discussed that showering every day nowadays would be shaveh lekol nefesh. Okay. Or למי חורה, ובגדי מקולס, מפני שדומה לקודשם. Why, regarding גדי מקולס, why the Chachamim say no? Because it's דומה לקודשם, ויאמרו מותר להקדיש ולאכול קודשם בחוץ. It's too similar. It looks like you're eating kodshim outside the Beit HaMikdash. This is also the discussion we have nowadays regarding on the night of Pesach. Is one allowed to eat roast meat without sauce? So there is those that many have the minhag, the zah minhag, not to eat it because it is similar to the way the Korban Pesach was cooked, and there are those who have the minhag, specifically to have it like that, because right as a zecher mikdash, and they're not concerned that it's going to be that it's not going to be like eating kosher bachutz. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. We'll stop there. As I said, no shiur tomorrow, unfortunately, but we will pick it up next week as well. A good day, everyone.
Okay, be well. Before
Thank you.
Shlema.
Yeah.
Shlema.